Next part is basically divide and test. We're actually getting ready to graph because we got some critical parts. Now remember, in behavior, we decided we needed to look at the beginning. We had a positive even, which meant our ends were both up. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and start. So here's my rough graph. 1, 2, 3, 4. And by the way, these are not going to be perfect, because if I wanted perfect, we'd be using computerized graphing. All right. So I'm going to put on what I know. I know I have a y-intercept here. I know I have 1, 0. I have negative 1, 0. And I have negative 2, 0. Okay? I also know I have in behavior saying both up. So I'm going to kind of pencil those in. Now, step 4 says I divide and test. And I need test points to left and right of each of my zeros. So I need one to the left of negative 2. Okay, so I'm actually going to bring this down. Now I need a test point to the left of negative 2. Negative 3. I need a test point to the right of negative 2, but to the left of negative 1. So something between negative 2 and negative 1. So I see a negative 1.5. I need a test point to the left of negative 1, but to the right of positive 1. How about 0? Just because it's the y-intercept doesn't mean it's not a valid test point, because it's still in between. Remember I said my zeros. Didn't say anything about the y-intercept. Okay? Now, I need a test point to the right of my positive 1, which is still another 0. So how about 2? Now here's the part that tends to bother students. I don't care what the final numbers are. What I care about is when I plug these into each of these parentheses, is whether or not the number that comes out of them is positive or negative. Okay? So if I plug in negative 3, and negative 3 minus 1 gives me a negative number, right? Negative 4. But when I square it, a negative times a negative is a positive. Negative 3 plus 1 gives me a negative 2. Negative 3 plus 2 gives me a negative 1. Now, these are all multiplying. If I have a positive number times a negative number, I get a negative number. If I have a negative number times a negative number, my final answer is going to be positive. Now, what does that tell me? That my graph at this point is above the line. It's above the x-axis. This is what I'm testing, is where's my graph falling? If my final answer is positive, it means it's above the x-axis. If my final answer is negative, it means it's falling below the axis. And I don't care the number. This is a rough graph. It's not exact. It's It's rough. That's the reason why we don't really worry about the numbers. All right. Now stop and think about this. No matter what number I put into this parenthesis, once I square it, what number, once you square, it's ever going to be negative? There isn't. A negative times a negative is a positive, and a positive times a positive is a positive. So this first number, no matter what, will always come out positive. So we can go ahead and take care of that first parenthesis all the way down. So let's take care of the rest of them. If I plug in a negative 1.5 here, negative 1.5 plus 1 gives me a negative number. Negative 1.5 plus 2 gives me a positive number. A positive times a negative times a positive equals a negative. So that means my graph at this point goes below the axis. How far down? Don't know, don't care. So I make a little dip. And I know it's a little dip because there's not much space between here and here. Well, guess what? I know this answer. If I plug in 0 through all this, I know it's a positive because I know what the answer is 2, which is positive. So I know he comes up to this. All right. And odds are, guess what? Remember at positive 2 or positive 1, he touches. That means I know he's going to come down and bounce and touch. Because this whole area has to be above. So now let's check to make sure that this side is still above the graph, which I know is, but we're still going to confirm it. This, again, I know is positive. I plug in 2 plus 1. I know I get a positive number. 2 plus 2, I know I get a positive number. Positive times a positive times a positive, guess what? Is a positive number. I have my rough graph, guys. And step 5 is my graph. Step 4 and 5, we pretty much do simultaneously. How are we feeling about graphing a polynomial? Hopefully decent. I will probably do one more from start to finish and post it.